The saloon door swung shut behind Clara with a finality that echoed through her bones. She clutched the worn leather satchel against her chest, its meager contents: a spare dress, a chipped hand mirror, and $17 in crumpled bills, representing all she owned in this unforgiving world. The autumn wind of 1887 cut through her thin shawl like accusations, each gust carrying the phantom scent of cheap whiskey and stale tobacco that had permeated her life for the past 3 years. Main Street stretched before her, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of oil lamps that flickered like dying stars. The town of Copper Creek was settling into its nightly routine, piano music drifting from the silver dollar, raucous laughter spilling from doorways, the occasional crack of a pistol fired in jest or anger. Clara kept her head low, her auburn hair tucked beneath a faded bonnet, praying no one would recognize her in the shadows. "There goes the saloon girl," she heard someone mutter from a porch. The words struck her like physical blows, but she forced her feet to keep moving. Each step took her farther from the Golden Horseshoe Saloon, from the leering faces and grasping hands, from the room upstairs where she'd spent countless nights staring at water stains on the ceiling, wondering if this was all life would ever offer. The desert beckoned beyond the town's edge, vast and merciless beneath a purple-black sky studded with stars like shards of broken glass. Clara had studied the old map tacked to the saloon's wall during quiet afternoons, memorizing the trail that led toward the distant mountain range. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay California, or perhaps Oregon, places where no one knew her name or her shame. As she passed the last building, a shabby boarding house with peeling paint, Clara paused to look back. Copper Creek seemed smaller from here, just a cluster of wooden structures huddled against the immensity of the wilderness. She thought of the moment 3 hours ago that had finally broken her resolve to endure, when Samuel Morrison, the saloon's owner, had cornered her in the storage room, his breath hot with whiskey, telling her she owed him more than just serving drinks. The memory made her stomach turn. The trail was barely visible in the darkness, a ribbon of packed earth winding through sagebrush and scattered rocks. Clara's boots, meant for wooden floors rather than rough terrain, struggled for purchase on the uneven ground. The weight of her decision pressed upon her with each step. She had no horse, no gun, no real plan beyond escape. All she possessed was a desperate need to reclaim something of herself that had been slowly eroding beneath the weight of men's assumptions and society's judgment. An hour into her journey, the cold began to seep through her clothing. The desert, scorching by day, turned bitter at night. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter, her breath forming small clouds in the air. In the distance, a coyote's howl rose and fell like a mournful song. She'd heard plenty of coyotes from the safety of town, but out here, alone with nothing but moonlight for company, the sound sent shivers down her spine. Her mind drifted to her childhood in Missouri, before the fever took her parents, before her uncle sold the farm and disappeared with the money, leaving her with nothing but a letter of introduction to a respectable establishment out west. How naive she'd been, stepping off that stagecoach 3 years ago, believing she'd find honest work. The Golden Horseshoe had seemed legitimate enough at first, just serving drinks. Morrison had promised, nothing more. But promises in frontier towns were as substantial as smoke. The memories threatened to overwhelm her. The first time a customer had grabbed her waist and Morrison had laughed it off. The gradual realization that the other girls did more than pour whiskey. The crushing weight of having nowhere else to go. No money to leave. No family to return to. Each humiliation had chipped away at her spirit until she'd almost believed the whispers, that she was nothing more than what they said she was. A rustling in the brush made Clara freeze. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she strained to see through the darkness. Tales of bandits and wild animals filled her mind. She had nothing to defend herself with except the small knife she used for cutting loose threads, tucked now in her boot. The rustling came again, closer, and she held her breath. A jackrabbit burst from the sagebrush, bounding across the trail in panicked leaps. Clara exhaled shakily, almost laughing at her fear. but the moment of relief was short-lived. If a rabbit could startle her so badly, how would she handle real dangers? The vastness of her undertaking pressed upon her. She was a woman alone in the wilderness, with no survival skills beyond what she'd gleaned from overheard conversations in the saloon. Still, she pressed on. The alternative, returning to Copper Creek, to Morrison's anger at her departure, to the knowing looks and whispered judgments, was unthinkable. Better to die free in the desert than live captive in that upstairs room. The trail began to climb, winding into the foothills. Clara's legs burned with the unfamiliar exertion. She'd spent 3 years on her feet. True, but walking between tables on smooth floors was different from hiking rough terrain. Her boots, already worn, began to pinch and rub. She knew blisters were forming but didn't dare stop to check. Movement was momentum, and momentum was all that kept her from dissolving into tears. As she climbed higher, the landscape transformed. The flat desert gave way to juniper and pinyon pine, their twisted forms creating grotesque shadows in the moonlight. The air grew thinner, colder. Clara's breath came in short gasps, whether from exertion or the creeping edge of panic. She couldn't tell. Near midnight, exhaustion forced her to rest. She found a cluster of boulders that provided minimal shelter from the wind and sank down, her legs trembling. For the first time since leaving, she allowed herself to fully feel the magnitude of what she'd done. She had fled with no word to anyone, not even to Beth, the only girl at the Golden Horseshoe who'd shown her genuine kindness. Morrison would be furious. He'd probably already discovered her absence, might even send someone after her. The thought made her stomach clench. But stronger than fear was a strange, unfamiliar sensation, a lightness in her chest, as if a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its presence had suddenly lifted. She was free, terrified, cold, and possibly foolish, but free. No one owned her out here. The desert didn't care about her past or judge her choices. Under the vast canopy of stars, she was simply Clara. Not the saloon girl or that woman upstairs. A sound made her stiffen, the distant clip-clop of hooves on stone. Clara pressed herself against the boulder, making herself as small as possible. The hoofbeats grew closer, steady and unhurried. A single rider, by the sound of it. Her mind raced through possibilities. A traveler heading to town, a rancher checking property, a bandit seeking easy prey, or worse, someone Morrison had sent after her. The rider came into view, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, a tall figure on a dark horse, moving with the easy grace of someone accustomed to long nights in the saddle. Clara held her breath, praying he would pass without noticing her. But horses had keen senses, and the animal's head turned toward her hiding spot. It nickered softly. The rider reined in, his head turning to scan the rocks. Clara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. In the moonlight, she could make out few details: a wide-brimmed hat, broad shoulders, the glint of metal that might be a gun at his hip. He sat perfectly still, listening. "I know someone's there," he said finally. His voice was deep, gravelly, but not unkind. "I mean no harm. These hills aren't safe at night for anyone alone." Clara remained frozen, weighing her options: reveal herself to a stranger or stay hidden and hope he moved on. But something in his tone, a weariness that matched her own, made her decision. "I'm armed," she lied, standing slowly. "Don't come any closer." The rider's hands remained visible, one holding the reins, the other resting on his saddle horn. "Fair enough," he said. "Though I'd wager that knife in your boot won't do much good at this distance." Clara's blood chilled. How had he known? In the darkness, he couldn't possibly see the small bulge in her boot. Unless... "You passed through Copper Creek," she said, not quite a question. "This afternoon," he confirmed. "Heard talk in the saloon about a girl who served drinks. Morrison was in a foul mood, threatening all kinds of retribution when he found her." Clara's legs nearly gave out. So it had begun already. Morrison's reach was longer than she'd hoped. "I don't work there anymore," she said, lifting her chin despite her fear. "I figured as much." The rider shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. Trail gets rough ahead. Temperature's dropping too. There's decent shelter about 2 miles on. An old line shack. You could freeze out here. Why should I trust you? He was quiet for a moment. Then, you shouldn't. But options get limited when the desert's trying to kill you. I'm heading that direction anyway. You can follow at a distance if it makes you feel safer. Without waiting for her response, he clicked his tongue and the horse moved on, hooves ringing against stone. Clara stood there, shivering, watching his form recede into the darkness. Every instinct screamed against following a strange man into the wilderness. But the cold was seeping into her bones, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each passing minute. The stranger kept his word, maintaining a steady pace ahead while Clara followed at what she hoped was a safe distance. His horse's silhouette moved like a ghost against the starlit trail, never hurrying, never slowing. She noticed how he chose his path carefully, avoiding loose rocks and steep grades, the mark of someone who knew these hills intimately. After 20 minutes of climbing, Clara's legs trembled with each step. The thin air made her dizzy, and the cold had progressed from uncomfortable to dangerous. Her fingers were numb despite being tucked under her arms, and she could no longer feel her toes in the worn boots. Pride had kept her going this far, but pride wouldn't prevent frostbite. The rider stopped at a bend in the trail, dismounting with practiced ease. "The shack's just ahead," he called back, his voice carrying clearly in the still night. "I'm going to gather some firewood. Door's not locked." Clara watched him tie his horse to a sturdy juniper before disappearing into the shadows. She approached cautiously, ready to run despite her exhaustion. The line shack materialized from the darkness, a small structure of weathered logs chinked with mud, its roof patched with tin that gleamed dully in the moonlight. It looked abandoned but solid. The door opened with a protesting creak. Inside, her eyes adjusted to reveal a single room with bare essentials: a pot-bellied stove, a narrow cot with moth-eaten blankets, a rough table and 2 chairs, and shelves holding a few canned goods covered in dust. It smelled of mice and old smoke, but after the bitter wind outside, it felt like a sanctuary. Clara heard the stranger returning, his boots crunching on frost-hardened earth. She positioned herself near the door, hand on her concealed knife, as he entered with an armload of wood. In the dim light filtering through the single window, she got her first real look at him. He was perhaps 35, with the weathered features of a man who'd spent years under the desert sun. Dark hair showed beneath his hat, and a day's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, were an indeterminate color in the darkness but held a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. He moved deliberately, making no sudden gestures that might alarm her. "Name's Elias," he said, kneeling by the stove. "Elias Hartley. I run cattle about 15 miles north of here." Clara hesitated before responding. "Clara." She offered no surname, and he didn't ask for one. Elias built the fire with efficiency, and soon warmth began to creep into the small space. He pulled a bundle from his saddlebags: dried beef, hardtack, and a dented tin coffee pot. "Hungry," Clara's stomach answered before she could, growling loudly in the quiet room. She hadn't eaten since morning, too nervous about her planned escape to keep anything down. Elias's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement as he set about preparing simple fare. They ate in silence. Clara perched on the edge of a chair, ready to bolt if necessary. The dried beef was tough and salty, the hardtack like chewing leather, but it was sustenance. The coffee, when it finally boiled, was black as midnight and bitter enough to strip paint, but its warmth spreading through her chest was heavenly. "You're running from more than just Morrison," Elias observed, not looking at her as he spoke. Clara stiffened. "That's my business." "It is," he agreed easily. "But these mountains have a way of killing folks who aren't prepared. That dress isn't made for traveling, and those boots are already giving you trouble." She glanced down at her feet, unable to deny the truth. Blood had seeped through the worn leather where blisters had formed and burst. "I'll manage. The next town's 3 days' walk. Longer if the weather turns. He refilled her coffee cup without asking. And it always turns this time of year. Why do you care? The question came out sharper than intended. Defensive. Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Maybe because I've been where you are. Different circumstances, but the same need to put distance between yourself and what you can't bear to be anymore. Something in his tone made Clara study him more closely. She noticed then what she'd missed before, the way he held himself slightly favored to one side, the careful movement that spoke of old pain, the faded blue of what might have been a uniform jacket hung on a peg by the door. "The war?" she asked softly. He nodded once. "Among other things. Point is, I know what it's like to need a clean break. Also know it's harder than it looks." Clara wrapped her hands around the hot tin cup, letting its warmth seep into her cold fingers. "I can't go back. Didn't say you should, but there are ways to go forward that don't involve dying of exposure in these hills. Such as, there's a freight wagon that passes through Millbrook. That's the town I mentioned. Driver's a decent sort. Owes me a favor. He could get you to the railroad at Prescott. From there," he shrugged, "anywhere you want." "And what would you want in return?" Clara asked, suspicion hardening her voice. She'd learned that men's favors always came with a price. Elias looked at her directly then, and she saw something in his expression that surprised her, understanding mixed with a sadness that ran deep. "Nothing. Sometimes folks just need help. In my experience, nobody helps for nothing." "Then you've had poor experiences." He stood, moving to add more wood to the fire. "Get some rest. I'll bed down outside with my horse. In this cold? I've slept in worse. Lock the door if it makes you feel safer." He gathered his blanket roll and headed for the door. Clara found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "You could stay by the fire, on the floor. I mean, it's too cold outside." Elias paused, then nodded. "Appreciated." He spread his blankets near the stove, as far from the cot as the small space allowed. "I'll wake you before dawn. Best to travel early, before the heat." Clara lay on the narrow cot, still wearing her dress and boots, the thin blanket pulled to her chin. Despite her exhaustion, sleep wouldn't come. Every sound made her tense, the pop of wood in the stove, the wind rattling the tin patches on the roof, Elias's steady breathing from across the room. She thought about his offer. Millbrook, a freight wagon, the railroad. It sounded too easy, too good to be true. Yet something about Elias made her want to believe. Maybe it was the way he'd kept his distance without her asking, or how he'd offered help without the leering undertones she'd grown accustomed to. Or maybe it was simply that she had no better options. In the darkness, she heard him shift, a small grunt of discomfort escaping. "Old wound?" she asked quietly. "Shiloh," came the reply. "Took grape shot in the side, healed poorly." "I'm sorry. Long time ago." A pause. "Though some things never really heal, do they? Just learn to carry them better." Clara closed her eyes, understanding too well. "No, they don't." "That why you're running? Someone hurt you?" "Among other things." She echoed his earlier words. "Morrison's a pig," Elias said bluntly. "Known it since he came to town 2 years back. Way he runs that place, the girls he brings in, it's not right." "You go there often?" Clara couldn't keep the edge from her voice. "Once, looking for information about cattle thieves. Didn't like what I saw. Never went back." He was quiet for a moment. "You weren't the first to run, you know. About 6 months ago, a girl named Sarah. Morrison sent men after her." Clara's blood chilled. "What happened?" "She made it to Tucson. Last I heard, she was working at a legitimate hotel, doing laundry, living quiet but free." "How do you know this?" "I helped her get there." Clara sat up slightly, studying his profile in the firelight. "Why?" "Because someone should have helped my sister." The words came out flat, final. Too late for her, but not for others. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken stories. Clara lay back down, processing this information. A man who helped women escape Morrison. It seemed impossible. Like something from the dime novels she used to read before life taught her that heroes were fiction. "Get some sleep," Elias said. "Tomorrow will be hard enough without starting it exhausted." This time, Clara found herself able to close her eyes. The fire crackled softly. And despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the strange man sleeping across the room, she felt safer than she had in years. It was a dangerous feeling. She knew trust had betrayed her before, but for tonight, in this ramshackle shelter against the cold, she allowed herself the luxury of not being entirely alone. She dreamed of her mother's voice, singing lullabies in their small Missouri kitchen, of sunlight through gingham curtains and the smell of bread baking, of a time when the world had been smaller but infinitely safer, before she knew what men could take from a woman who had no one to protect her. Dawn came too soon, gray light seeping through cracks in the walls. Clara woke to find Elias already up, coffee brewing on the stove. He'd been outside, fresh snow dusted his shoulders. "Storm's coming," he said without preamble. "We need to move if we're going to beat it to Millbrook." "We? Unless you prefer to go alone. Your choice." Clara looked through the window at the white-shrouded landscape. Snow was already falling steadily, transforming the harsh terrain into something deceptively soft. She thought of Morrison's men, possibly on her trail, of the 3-day walk through unfamiliar mountains, of the promise of a freight wagon and a train ticket to anywhere but here. "I'll go with you," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Elias nodded as if he'd expected no other answer. "There's spare clothes in that trunk. Belonged to the line riders who used to work this area. Not pretty, but warmer than what you're wearing." Clara found wool trousers, a flannel shirt, and a heavy coat that smelled of tobacco and hard work. They were too large, but infinitely more practical than her thin dress. She changed behind the blanket Elias held up, grateful for the privacy. When she emerged, transformed from saloon girl to frontier traveler, Elias studied her with approval. "Better? Can you ride?" "A little." It wasn't quite a lie. She'd ridden her father's plow horse as a child. "You'll ride. I'll walk alongside. Storm's going to make the trail dangerous." They left the shack as the sun struggled to penetrate the heavy clouds. Elias helped her mount his horse, a patient bay mare who seemed unfazed by the weather. Clara gripped the saddle horn, aware of how high off the ground she was, how vulnerable. But as they began the descent toward Millbrook, something shifted inside her. Each step took her farther from Clara the saloon girl, the woman defined by others' desires and assumptions. Out here, dressed in men's clothing, facing an uncertain future but making her own choices, she began to feel the shape of who she might become. The snow fell harder, transforming the world into a white wilderness. Elias walked steadily beside the horse, one hand on the bridle, guiding them through the increasingly treacherous terrain. He moved with the steady confidence of someone who'd faced worse storms, both literal and metaphorical. And Clara, clutching the saddle as the wind tried to tear her away, realized that for the first time in 3 years, she was moving towards something rather than merely enduring. The destination remained unclear, the dangers real, but she was in motion. It was a start. The snow had stopped by the time they made camp that first night, finding shelter beneath an overhang of red rock that provided protection from the wind. Clara's body ached from hours in the saddle, muscles she didn't know she possessed screaming in protest. But there was something satisfying about the pain. It was earned through her own choices, not inflicted by others. Elias built their fire with the same quiet efficiency she'd observed the night before, and soon they had coffee boiling and beans warming in a battered pot. The simple meal tasted better than anything from the Golden Horseshoe's kitchen, perhaps because she ate it as a free woman. "Tell me about your sister," Clara said suddenly, surprising herself with the question. Elias's hand stilled on the cup he was cleaning. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Margaret, Maggie, she was 17 when I left for the war. Prettiest girl in Monroe County. And smart, too. Could cipher better than the schoolmaster." He stared into the fire, and Clara remained silent. sensing more coming. Our parents died when she was 14. Fever took them both in the same week. I was 20. Thought I could take care of her, keep the farm going, but the war came, and I felt called to serve. Left her with our aunt. His voice turned bitter. Aunt ran a boarding house in town, seemed respectable enough. Clara's stomach tightened, already guessing where this story led. Only it wasn't just a boarding house. By the time I came home, Maggie was gone. Took her own life rather than continue living that way. He picked up a stick, poking at the fire. Found out later our aunt had debts. Creditors threatened to take the house, so she'd use Maggie to pay them off. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, the words inadequate. "Wasn't your fault. Wasn't even Maggie's fault, though she blamed herself. It was mine. For leaving. For trusting the wrong person. For not seeing what was right in front of me." He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "That's why I helped Sarah. Why I'm helping you. Can't change the past, but maybe I can balance the scales a little." They sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara pulled the borrowed coat tighter, breathing in its scent of leather and long-ago tobacco. Strange how wearing men's clothing made her feel more like herself than any dress ever had. As if the trappings of femininity had been just another cage. "What will you do when you reach the railroad?" Elias asked eventually. "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I have some money saved. Not much, but enough for a ticket somewhere. Maybe California. I heard there's work in San Francisco for women who can read and write. You're educated?" "My mother was a school teacher before she married. She taught me at home." Clara smiled at the memory. Said a woman needed to be twice as smart as a man to get half as far in the world. Wise woman. She was. Clara's smile faded. I wonder what she'd think of me now. What I became. "You survived," Elias said firmly. "That takes its own kind of wisdom." Morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. They broke camp early. Clara once again in the saddle while Elias walked alongside. As they descended from the higher elevations, the landscape changed from pine forest to high desert, painted in shades of red and gold beneath the winter sun. They talked as they traveled, carefully at first, then with growing ease. Clara learned that Elias had been a sergeant in the Union Army, had seen action at Shiloh and Antietam before the grape shot that ended his military service. After the war, he drifted west like so many veterans, eventually finding work on a cattle ranch. When the owner died without heirs, he'd left Elias a section of land and a small herd, enough to build on if a man was willing to work hard and live lean. In turn, Clara found herself sharing more than she'd intended. About her father, a dreamer who'd always talked about going west but never made it past Missouri, about the fever that had swept through their town, taking both parents within days of each other. About her uncle's betrayal and the desperate journey west with nothing but false promises to guide her. "I was so naive," she said, watching a hawk circle overhead. "Thought the Golden Horseshoe really was just a saloon needing a respectable girl to serve drinks and maybe sing on Saturday nights. Morrison seemed so kind at first, so understanding about my situation. Men like him are good at seeming kind." Elias said, "It's how they trap people." For 6 months, it was almost what he'd promised. Then one of the other girls left sudden-like, and Morrison said I needed to be more friendly to the customers. Said I owed him for room and board, for taking a chance on a girl with no experience. Clara's voice hardened. When I refused, he made it clear I couldn't leave. Said I owed him too much money, that he'd have me arrested for theft if I tried to run. "Bastard," Elias muttered. I might have believed him too. Except Sarah, the girl you mentioned. She told me it was all lies before she left. Said Morrison did this to all the girls, invented debts to keep them trapped. She was going to run that very night. Asked if I wanted to come. Clara shook her head. I was too scared. Thought maybe if I just kept serving drinks, kept saying no, things would get better. But they didn't. No, they got worse. The other girls, most of them had given up fighting. Said it was easier to just accept it, that the money wasn't bad if you didn't think too hard about what you were doing, But I couldn't. Every time a man would grab at me, every time Morrison would corner me with his threats and promises, I felt another piece of myself dying. They stopped to rest the horse at a small spring, the water running clear and cold from the rocks. Clara dismounted, wincing at the protest from her sore muscles. She knelt by the spring, cupping water in her hands, watching it run through her fingers like lost time. 3 days ago, Morrison gave me an ultimatum. She continued, said I'd been costing him money for too long, that it was time I earned my keep properly. He had a customer, some cattle buyer from Texas with particular tastes. Said if I didn't cooperate, he'd make sure every lawman in the territory knew I was a thief and worse. That night, I packed what little I had and slipped out during the late shift when everyone was drunk. You did the right thing, Elias said quietly. Did I? I have no plan, no connections, nowhere to go. Maybe the others were right. Maybe it's better to just accept. No. The word came out sharp, almost angry. Elias softened his tone. Don't ever think that. What those women do to survive, that's their choice, and I don't judge them for it. But you chose different. That takes courage. Clara looked at him, this strange man who'd appeared from the darkness to help her for no reason she could understand. Why aren't you married? A man with land, cattle. Seems like you'd have your pick of wives. Something shuddered in his expression. Had a fiancée once, before the war. Dear John letter came while I was in a field hospital. She married a banker who'd kept both his arms and didn't wake up screaming from nightmares. Her loss, Clara said, without thinking, then blushed at her boldness. Elias's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Maybe, or maybe she was smart to choose a whole man over a broken one. You're not broken, Clara protested. Wounded, maybe, but not broken. Broken men don't help strangers in the desert. They resumed their journey as the sun reached its zenith. The trail wound through a canyon where ancient peoples had carved symbols into the rock, messages from a time before memory. Clara found herself wondering what stories these stones could tell, what other travelers had passed this way seeking escape or redemption. There's something I should tell you, Elias said as they navigated a particularly narrow section. Morrison's reach is longer than you might think. He's got connections with lawmen in several towns, pays them to look the other way, or sometimes to bring back girls who run. Clara's heart sank. Then what's the point? If he can find me anywhere. Not anywhere. His influence fades the farther you get from Copper Creek. And there are places where the law still means something, where a woman's word carries weight. You just need to get far enough away. Establish yourself as a respectable citizen before any of his lies can catch up. And you think I can do that? Become respectable again? Elias stopped walking, turning to look up at her. You never stopped being respectable. Don't let Morrison or anyone else tell you different. What you did to survive doesn't define who you are. Tears pricked Clara's eyes, and she blinked them away fiercely. She'd cried enough over the past 3 years. Now wasn't the time for weakness. They made better time as the day wore on, the trail descending toward the valley where Millbrook waited. Elias pointed out landmarks, a formation called Devil's Throne, a grove of cottonwoods marking an old stage stop, the distant smudge of smoke from the town's chimneys. We'll reach Millbrook by nightfall, he said. There's a widow runs a boarding house, Mrs. Patterson. She's particular about her guests, but she'll take you on my word. You can rest there until the freight wagon comes through. When will that be? 2, maybe 3 days. Driver's name is Ben Carter. Good man, fought for the Union. He'll see you safe to Prescott. Clara noticed how carefully Elias had planned this, how thoroughly he'd thought through her escape. It made her both grateful and wary. In her experience, such consideration came with expectations, as if reading her thoughts. He said, I know you don't trust easy. Can't blame you for that, but some of us remember what it was like to need help and not have it. Consider this paying forward a debt I owe the universe. They rode in silence as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Clara found herself memorizing the moment, the creak of leather, the scent of sage and dust, the steady presence of this unlikely guardian. Whatever happened next, She wanted to remember this. The day she stopped running from and started running toward. The first buildings of Millbrook appeared as shadows against the dying light. Clara straightened in the saddle, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. In a few hours, Elias would leave her with strangers, trusting his arrangements to carry her to safety. The thought terrified her more than she cared to admit. "You'll be all right," he said, as if sensing her fear. "You're stronger than you know. How can you be sure? Because you left, because you're here, because despite everything, you haven't given up." He paused. "That's more than most can say." As they entered the outskirts of town, Clara allowed herself a moment of hope. Perhaps this was possible. Perhaps she could build a new life far from Morrison's shadow. Perhaps the girl who'd stepped off that stagecoach 3 years ago wasn't entirely lost. The boarding house came into view, neat and whitewashed with green shutters. Lamplight glowed warm in the windows. It looked like the kind of place where respectable people stayed, where a woman could begin again if she was brave enough to try. Clara took a deep breath, tasting freedom on the cold desert air. She was brave enough. She had to be. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house proved to be everything Elias had promised: clean, respectable, and run by a woman who asked few questions beyond whether Clara could pay for her room. The widow was perhaps 60, with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. "Mr. Hartley's word carries weight with me," she said, showing Clara to a small but tidy room on the second floor. "You'll take your meals with the other guests at 7, noon, and 6. No gentlemen callers, no spirits, no loud behavior. Break my rules and you'll find yourself back on the street, regardless of who vouched for you." Clara nodded, grateful for the strict propriety. After the false respectability of the Golden Horseshoe, genuine rules felt like safety. Elias had left after seeing her settled, pressing a few extra dollars into her hand despite her protests. "For emergencies," he'd said. "Carter won't be here for at least 2 days. You'll need to eat." Then he'd touched the brim of his hat and disappeared into the night, leaving Clara with an odd sense of loss. That first night in a real bed. Clara barely slept. Every creak of the building, every footstep in the hall sent her heart racing. She kept expecting Morrison to burst through the door, or to wake and find the past 3 days had been a dream. But morning came with nothing more threatening than Mrs. Patterson's knock announcing breakfast. The second day in Millbrook. Clara ventured out to purchase a few necessities with her carefully hoarded money. The town was larger than Copper Creek but had the same frontier roughness: unpaved streets that turned to mud when it rained, buildings thrown up quickly with little thought to permanence, and a population that seemed equally divided between those seeking fortune and those running from misfortune. She was examining bolts of fabric in the general store, thinking she might buy material for a proper traveling dress, when she heard the voice that made her blood freeze. "I told Morrison I'd check every town between here and Prescott. Girl couldn't have gotten far on foot." Clara ducked behind a display of farming implements, her heart hammering. Through gaps in the merchandise, she could see the speaker, Jake Thornton, one of Morrison's hired thugs. He was talking to the shopkeeper, showing him something that looked like a photograph. "Pretty thing, auburn hair, about yay high." Thornton was saying, "Goes by Clara. There's a reward for information leading to her return. Mr. Morrison's worried about her safety, traveling alone and all." The shopkeeper studied the photograph. "Haven't seen her, but I'll keep an eye out. What did you say she'd done?" "Stole from her employer. Considerable sum. 2, Mr. Morrison's willing to forgive it all if she just comes back peaceful-like." Clara bit her lip to keep from crying out at the lie. She'd taken nothing but her own earned wages, and precious few of those. But who would believe a saloon girl over a prosperous businessman? She waited until Thornton left, then slipped out the back door of the store. Her legs shook as she hurried back to the boarding house. Keeping to alleys and side streets, the fabric for a new dress would have to wait. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her knitting as Clara burst through the door. You look like you've seen a ghost, child. I need to speak with Mr. Hartley. Is there any way to send word to him? The widow's eyes sharpened. Trouble already? Clara hesitated, then decided on partial truth. Someone from my former employment is in town. I left under difficult circumstances. Mrs. Patterson set down her knitting. Sit. Tell me. Something in the older woman's tone made Clara sink into the offered chair. The story spilled out, not all of it. But enough. Morrison, the threats, the escape, and now Thornton hunting her with the lies about theft. When she finished, Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment. Then, I wondered when Elias brought you here. He doesn't often involve himself in others' troubles, but when he does, there's usually good reason. She stood, moving to a writing desk in the corner. His ranch is too far to send word in time, but there are other options. I should leave. I don't want to bring trouble to your house. Nonsense. I've dealt with worse than hired thugs in my time. Mrs. Patterson's smile was sharp as a blade. My late husband was a judge, child. I know the law, and I know when men are twisting it for their own ends. You'll stay right here until Carter arrives. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. She spent the rest of the day in her room, flinching at every sound from the street. When dinner came, she forced herself to go down and act normal among the other boarders, a traveling preacher and his wife, 2 miners heading to new claims, and a schoolteacher moving west to take a position. She was pushing food around her plate when heavy footsteps on the porch made everyone look up. The door opened, and Jake Thornton walked in, his eyes scanning the room like a predator seeking prey. Evening, folks, he said, touching his hat. Sorry to interrupt your meal. I'm looking for someone, and I heard this was the only respectable boarding house in town. Clara kept her eyes on her plate, praying he wouldn't recognize her in the proper dress Mrs. Patterson had lent her, with her hair pinned up respectably instead of hanging loose as it had at the saloon. This is a private establishment, Mrs. Patterson said coolly. If you're not seeking lodging, I'll ask you to leave. Now, ma'am, no need for hostility. I'm just looking for a young woman who's in some trouble. Her employer's mighty worried. Thornton pulled out the photograph. Pretty girl, goes by Clara. There's a reward for information. The schoolteacher, Miss Winters, leaned forward to look. What kind of trouble? Theft, ma'am. Took a considerable sum from her employer, a respectable businessman in Copper Creek. He just wants her back safe, willing to forgive the whole matter. How charitable of him. Mrs. Patterson said dryly. However, I run a respectable house. The type of woman who would steal from her employer wouldn't be welcome here. Thornton's eyes lingered on each face at the table. When they reached Clara, she forced herself to meet his gaze briefly, then look away with the mild interest of someone hearing gossip about a stranger. Her heart thundered so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Well, if you do see her, ma'am, Mr. Morrison would be grateful for word. He's staying at the Silverton Hotel. We'll be in town for a few days. Clara's stomach dropped. Morrison himself was here. The photograph, the lies about theft, the considerable sum. It was all an elaborate trap to force her back. After Thornton left, conversation resumed awkwardly. Clara excused herself as soon as she could, fleeing to her room. She was packing her few belongings when a knock came at the door. It's Mrs. Patterson. Open up, child. Clara let her in, and the widow took in the half-packed bag with a knowing look. Running won't help. They'll catch you on the road, alone and defenseless. I can't stay here. Morrison's at the Silverton. If he sees me, he won't. You'll stay in your room until Carter arrives. I'll have meals brought up. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. I know what it's like to be hunted by men who think they own you. Child, my husband saved me from such a situation once. Consider this my way of honoring his memory. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Clara watched from her window as Thornton made his rounds through town, questioning shopkeepers and loiterers. Once, she saw Morrison himself, his bulky form unmistakable even from a distance. He was talking to the sheriff, no doubt spinning his web of lies. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the street, she spotted another familiar figure. Elias rode into town, his movements casual but his eyes alert. He dismounted outside the boarding house, and Clara heard his voice downstairs, then footsteps on the stairs. "Clara?" He knocked softly. "It's Elias, Mrs. Patterson sent word." She opened the door, relief flooding through her. "Morrison's here. He's telling everyone I'm a thief." "I know. Saw Thornton at the saloon, drinking and boasting about the bonus he'll get for bringing you back." Elias stepped inside, his presence filling the small room. "Carter will be here tomorrow afternoon, but Morrison's getting impatient. He's talking about searching every building in town. He can't do that, can he? Not legally, but the sheriff here is weak, easily swayed by money. If Morrison pushes hard enough." Elias shrugged. "We need to get you out tonight." "But where? If they're watching the roads, my ranch. It's the last place they'd look, and I know trails they don't. We can circle back for Carter, get you on that wagon without Morrison knowing." Clara hesitated. 3 nights ago, she'd followed this man into the wilderness on faith alone. Now he was asking her to trust him again, to ride deeper into danger on the promise of safety. "All right," she said. "When do we leave?" "Now, while they're all at dinner. Mrs. Patterson will create a distraction if needed." Clara quickly finished packing, donning the men's clothing she'd kept. Elias led her down the back stairs and through the kitchen, where Mrs. Patterson waited with a bundle of food. "Godspeed, child," the widow said. "Don't let them win." They slipped out into the alley, where Elias had left his horse. This time, he'd brought a second mount, a sturdy paint mare. "Can you manage her?" Clara nodded, though her riding experience remained limited. They walked the horses quietly through back streets until they reached the edge of town, then mounted and rode into the gathering darkness. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead. They avoided the main trail, following deer paths and dry washes that wound through the hills. Clara concentrated on staying in the saddle, on matching Elias's pace, on not thinking about what would happen if Morrison's men caught them. An hour out of town, Elias called a brief halt to rest the horses. "You're doing well," he said. "Natural rider." "Liar," Clara managed, though she smiled. "Everything hurts. It gets easier." He studied the back trail, watching for pursuit. "They won't follow at night. Too easy to lose the trail. By morning, we'll be at the ranch." They rode on through a landscape turned silver by moonlight. Coyotes called in the distance, and once Clara saw the green eyeshine of something watching from the brush. But with Elias beside her, the dangers felt manageable. "Why are you doing this?" she asked during another rest. "Really, and don't say it's about your sister. This is more than that." Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Maybe because I'm tired of seeing men like Morrison win. Maybe because you remind me that not everyone gives up, even when giving up would be easier." He paused. "Or maybe I'm just a fool who can't mind his own business." "I'm glad you're a fool then," Clara said softly. They reached the ranch as dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold. It wasn't much, a small adobe house, a barn, corrals holding maybe 30 head of cattle, but it was well kept and solid, speaking of hard work and pride. "It's not fancy," Elias said, almost apologetically. "It's perfect," Clara replied, meaning it. After the false guilt of the saloon and the temporary shelter of boarding houses, this simple, honest place felt like a revelation. Elias helped her dismount, steadying her when her legs nearly buckled. "Come on, you need food and rest. We'll figure out the next step once you've slept." As she followed him into the house, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of possibility. Morrison was still out there, still hunting. The danger remained real. But for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach in Copper Creek, she wasn't facing it alone. The house was simple inside, one main room with a kitchen area, a bedroom beyond. Elias gave her the bedroom, saying he'd bunk in the barn. As Clara sank onto the narrow bed, exhaustion overwhelming her. She heard him moving about in the main room, stoking the fire, preparing food. Through the window, she could see the sun rising over the desert, painting the world in shades of gold and red. Somewhere out there, Morrison was waking to find his prey had vanished again. Let him search, let him rage. She was beyond his reach, at least for now. And tomorrow, Ben Carter would come, and she would continue her journey toward freedom. But for today, in this quiet place with its guardian who asked for nothing but offered everything, Clara allowed herself to rest. Clara woke to the sound of urgent voices. Sunlight slanted through the bedroom window. She'd slept through the morning and into afternoon. Elias's voice carried from the main room, tense and controlled. "Saw them in town this morning. Morrison's got 5 men now, and he's hired that tracker, Tom Briggs." Another voice, older and gravelly, responded, "Briggs could track a ghost through a sandstorm. If they pick up your trail from town." "I know." Elias sounded grim. "That's why you need to take her now. Ben, change of plans." Clara dressed quickly in the borrowed men's clothing and stepped into the main room. A weathered man in his 50s stood near the door, trail dust covering his worn coat. His eyes were kind but worried as they took her in. "Miss Clara," Ben Carter said, touching his hat. "Elias told me your situation. My wagon's hidden in the wash about a mile north, but we've got problems." "Morrison?" she asked, though she already knew. "He's turned half the territory against you with his lies." Ben said, "Posted rewards in 3 towns. Says you stole $500 and some jewelry from his safe." "I never—" Clara began hotly. "We know," Elias cut in. "But the truth doesn't matter when money talks louder. Ben, can you get her to Prescott?" "Not directly. They'll be watching the main roads. But I know freight routes they won't think to check. Take longer, maybe a week instead of 3 days, but safer. A week in hiding. A week of running." Clara felt exhaustion settle over her like a heavy blanket. Would it ever end? Would she spend her whole life looking over her shoulder? "There's another option," Elias said quietly. "Stay here. Let me deal with Morrison." "Deal with him how?" Clara asked, though the grim set of his jaw told her enough. "That's my concern." "No." The word came out sharper than intended. "I won't have bloodshed on my conscience, and killing Morrison won't erase the lies he's spread. I'd still be a fugitive." Ben shifted uncomfortably. "She's right. Elias, violence would only prove Morrison's point, make her look guilty. The law's bought and paid for." Elias snapped, then, more quietly, "But you're right, both of you." He turned to Clara. "Then we do this smart. Ben takes you to Prescott, but not alone. I'm coming too. Your ranch will survive a week without me. My neighbor owes me favors. He'll tend the stock." His tone brooked no argument. "You'll travel as my wife, respectable couple heading to Prescott on family business. Less suspicious than a woman alone with a freight hauler." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I couldn't ask." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Elias looked to Ben. "What do you think?" The older man considered. "Could work. I've got trade goods to deliver in Prescott anyway. You two could ride in the wagon, play the married couple. But we'd need to make it convincing." "How convincing?" Clara asked warily. "Rings, for starters," Ben said. "And you'd need to know each other's history well enough to fool questions. Morrison's men might stop us, might ask around. One slip and—" "We'll manage," Elias said. He moved to a small chest in the corner, returning with something that made Clara's breath catch, a simple gold band, worn thin with age. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "Keep it as a remembrance, but never thought." He held it out to her. "May I?" Clara extended her hand, surprised to find it trembling. The ring slipped onto her finger as if made for her. Such a small thing, a circle of gold, but the weight of it, the trust it represented, made her eyes burn with unshed tears. "I'll need to know about your family," she said, voice not quite steady. "Where you're from, how we met, all of it." "We have time while Ben prepares the wagon," Elias said. "But first, we need to deal with evidence. That dress you were wearing. Anything from the saloon, it all needs to go. Clara retrieved her few belongings, including the faded dress she'd fled in, without ceremony. Elias fed it to the stove fire, watching the fabric curl and blacken. Clara felt as if part of her past was burning too. The girl who'd worn that dress, who'd served drinks and dodged grabbing hands, she was disappearing in smoke and ash. Now then, Elias said, settling at the table. Let's create a marriage. They spent the next hour constructing a shared history. Married 2 years, meeting in Kansas where Clara was teaching school and Elias was buying cattle. No children yet, but hoping. Traveling to Prescott to settle her fictional father's estate. The details came easily, and Clara found herself almost believing the fiction they wove. You're good at this, Ben observed. Almost like you've done it before. During the war, sometimes had to scout in civilian clothes. Elias said, learn to build a character quickly. He looked at Clara. What about you? You're taking to it natural. 3 years of pretending to be someone I wasn't. Clara said simply, at least this time, I'm choosing the role. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they prepared to leave. Clara packed the few things she'd need in a carpet bag Ben provided, including a respectable dress his late wife had kept in the wagon. Elias saddled their horses. They'd ride to where Ben had hidden the wagon, then leave the mounts with his trusted neighbor. Before they departed, Elias showed Clara how to load and fire his spare revolver. Just in case, he said. Sometimes showing you're armed is enough to prevent trouble. The weight of the gun felt foreign in her hands, but Clara practiced until she could manage the basics. Another skill she'd never imagined needing. Another step away from the woman she'd been. They left as the sun touched the western mountains, riding single file through terrain that hid them from casual view. Clara wore Elias's mother's ring and tried to think like a wife, to move with the casual familiarity of a woman beside her husband. It should have felt like another performance, another lie. Instead, it felt strangely natural. Ben's wagon waited in a dry wash, covered with canvas and loaded with goods. He'd already hitched his team, 4 sturdy mules who regarded the newcomers with mild interest. The wagon bed held barrels and crates, with space carved out for passengers among the cargo. It won't be comfortable, Ben warned, but it'll keep you hidden if needed. They transferred their belongings, and Elias helped Clara onto the wagon seat. As his hands lingered at her waist, steadying her, she caught his eye. Something passed between them, acknowledgement of the strange intimacy they were about to share. The trust required to make this deception work. The first night, they camped in a hidden canyon Ben knew. Over a small fire, they continued refining their story, with Ben playing the role of interrogator. How did you propose? He asked Elias. After a church social, walked her home, asked her father's permission first. What was the weather? October, leaves turning. Cold enough she wore that blue shawl she favored. Good, Ben said. Then to Clara, where did you honeymoon? We didn't. Elias had to return to his ranch, and I had to finish the school term. We had a small ceremony and saved money for our future instead. Ben nodded approval. You're thinking like married folks, the little disappointments, the practical choices. That's what makes it real. As they bedded down, Clara in the wagon, the men nearby, she touched the ring on her finger. In the darkness, she could almost believe it was real, that she was a respectable married woman traveling with her husband, not a runaway saloon girl fleeing a man who viewed her as property. The second day brought their first test. A group of riders appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Ben pulled the wagon into a cluster of cottonwoods while Elias loosened his pistol in its holster. Easy, Ben murmured. Just travelers, maybe. But Clara recognized one of the riders, Jake Thornton. Her blood chilled as the group approached. Elias's hand found hers, squeezing gently. Mrs. Hartley, he said quietly. Perhaps you should check on those preserves in the back. This sun might be spoiling them. Understanding. Clara moved into the wagon bed, pulling canvas aside as if checking goods while actually concealing herself among the barrels. Afternoon, gentlemen, she heard Ben call out cheerfully. "Hot day for hard riding. We're looking for someone." Thornton's voice, harsh and demanding. "Woman traveling alone. Might have stolen a horse. Auburn hair, about 25. "Haven't seen anyone like that," Elias said calmly. "Just me, my wife, and Ben here, heading to Prescott on family business." "Your wife?" Thornton sounded suspicious. "Where is she?" "Right here," Clara said. Emerging from the wagon with a jar of preserves in hand, she'd pulled her hair into a severe bun and affected a slight stoop, aging herself. "Elizabeth Hartley, is there a problem? Gentlemen?" Thornton's eyes raked over her, but the harsh hairstyle, the modest dress, and her submissive posture beside Elias clearly didn't match his expectations. "No problem, ma'am. Just looking for a thief. Woman's dangerous. Killed a man in Copper Creek." Clara's hand tightened on the jar, but she kept her expression mildly interested. "How dreadful. We'll certainly keep watch. You do that." Thornton wheeled his horse around. "Come on, boys. They probably headed south." The riders thundered off, leaving dust in their wake. Clara sank onto the wagon seat, shaking. Elias's arm came around her shoulders, and she leaned into him without thinking. "Killed a man?" she whispered. "Morrison's getting desperate," Ben said grimly. "Adding murder to the charges, we need to move faster." They pushed hard the rest of the day, Ben taking risks with the trail he normally would have avoided. That night, they camped without a fire, eating cold biscuits and dried meat. Clara lay awake in the wagon, listening to the men take turns on watch. "She fled the saloon, shame," she whispered to herself, remembering a phrase from a novel she'd once read. Until the brooding cowboy took her past and her trembling soul. It seemed like something from another life, that girl who'd believed in romance and happy endings. Yet here she was, fleeing with a man who asked nothing but gave everything, wearing his mother's ring, pretending to be his wife while something real grew between them. The third day dawned with clouds building on the horizon. Ben sniffed the air worriedly. "Storm coming, big one. We need to find shelter." They pressed on, racing the weather. The wind picked up, driving sand and grit before it. Clara pulled a scarf over her face, squinting against the assault. Lightning flickered in the approaching clouds, and thunder rolled across the desert like war drums. "There!" Elias pointed to a cluster of buildings, an abandoned mining camp, long deserted. They reached it just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. The buildings were in poor shape, but better than nothing. They pulled the wagon under a partially collapsed structure that still had most of its roof. The mules were hobbled in what had been a storehouse, with access to old hay that, while musty, was better than nothing. Rain came down in sheets, turning the abandoned streets into rivers. They huddled in what had been the camp office, relatively dry but cold. Elias built a small fire in the still functional fireplace, and they dried their clothes as best they could. "We'll be stuck here until this passes," Ben said. "Could be hours. Could be days. Morrison's men will be stuck too," Elias pointed out. "Maybe this is good luck disguised." Clara stood at the broken window, watching the storm rage. Somewhere out there, Morrison was hunting her with lies that grew worse by the day, from theft to murder. What would be next? She touched the ring on her finger, drawing comfort from its presence. "Tell me about your mother," she said to Elias. "The woman who wore this ring." Elias joined her at the window. "Strong woman. Had to be, raising 2 children alone after my father died. Kept the farm going with just her hands and will. Never remarried, though she had offers. Said she'd had her great love and wouldn't settle for less. She sounds wonderful. She would have liked you. I think, appreciated women with backbone." He paused. "Wore that ring for 40 years. Never took it off, even when times were so hard she could have sold it for food money. I'll keep it safe," Clara promised. Until we reach Prescott. Keep it after," Elias said quietly. "It should be worn, not hidden in a chest." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Clara turned to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart race. In that moment, with the storm raging outside and the firelight painting shadows on his face, she wanted to step into his arms and make their pretend marriage real. But Jake Thornton's words echoed in her mind. She was a wanted woman now, accused of theft and murder. She had no right to want anything beyond survival. Certainly no right to burden this good man with her troubles beyond what he'd already volunteered. "I should check the supplies," she said, breaking the moment. "Make sure nothing's getting wet." But as she turned away, Elias caught her hand. "Clara, when this is over, when you're safe—" He stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. "When I'm safe, you'll go back to your ranch and your real life," she finished for him. "And I'll go somewhere, become someone new. That's how it has to be." "Does it?" Before she could answer, Ben burst through the door. "Riders coming, saw them through the rain, looks like Thornton again. They must be checking every possible shelter." Clara's moment of peace shattered. Once again, she was the hunted, and the storm that had seemed like protection now trapped them. But as Elias checked his weapons and Ben prepared their story, Clara felt something harden inside her. She was tired of running, tired of fear. "Give me the gun," she said to Elias. "If they want a dangerous woman, maybe it's time they found one." The riders appeared through the driving rain like phantoms, their horses struggling against the wind. Clara counted 6 men, Thornton and 5 others, including one massive figure she recognized with a chill of dread. Morrison himself, no longer content to let his hired men do the hunting. "Back room," Elias said tersely. "Both of you, I'll handle this." "No." Clara's voice was steady despite her racing heart. "Running and hiding hasn't worked. It's time to face this. Clara, she's my wife, remember?" She forced a grim smile. Elizabeth Hartley wouldn't cower in the back room. Before Elias could argue further, the door burst open. Wind and rain swept in with the men, who spread out to block any escape. Morrison filled the doorway, water streaming from his coat, his face flushed with anger and exertion. "Well, well," he said, his eyes finding Clara immediately despite her changed appearance. "Hello, Clara. You've led us quite a chase." "I believe you're mistaken," Clara said, affecting a slight accent she'd heard from Eastern travelers. "I'm Elizabeth Hartley. This is my husband, Elias." Morrison laughed. An ugly sound. "Drop the act. I'd know you anywhere. Girl, you belong to me, and it's time to come home." "The lady said you're mistaken." Elias stepped forward, hand resting on his pistol. "I'll ask you to apologize for your language and leave. Stay out of this, cowboy. This is between me and my property." "Property?" Clara felt rage override fear. "I was never your property. Samuel Morrison, I was an employee, and I left your employment. That's all." "You were whatever I said you were." Morrison snarled. "And you took something that belongs to me when you left. I took nothing but my wages. You took yourself." The words exploded from Morrison. 3 years I invested in you, fed you, housed you, kept you in pretty dresses. You owed me return on that investment." The naked greed in his voice, the casual way he spoke of her as commodity, made Clara's stomach turn. But it also clarified something. This was never about theft or murder or any crime except the crime of a woman claiming her own life. "I owe you nothing," she said clearly. "And I'll die before I go back with you." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun. "That can be arranged." The click of Elias cocking his pistol was loud in the small room. "Touch that iron and you're dead." 6 against 2, Thornton pointed out. 3 if you count the old man. Not good odds. "Good enough," Ben said from behind them. The old freighter had slipped out during the confrontation and now stood in the doorway with a shotgun. "This scattergun says different." Morrison's face darkened further. "You don't know what you're interfering with. This woman's a thief and a murderer. There's paper on her in 3 territories." "Lies," Elias said flatly. "Your lies, and they end here." "You willing to die for a saloon girl?" Morrison sneered. "Because that's what she is," No matter what games you're playing, everyone knows what she really is. Clara felt the old shame trying to rise, but something new pushed it down. Anger, clean and bright. Yes, I worked in your saloon. I served drinks to survive when I had no other choice, but what I am is a free woman, and what you are is a man who preys on the desperate. Big words, Morrison said. But words won't stop me from taking what's mine. That's when they heard it. Horses approaching fast. Many of them. Morrison's men tensed, hands moving to weapons. Through the rain came a voice calling, "Hello, the camp. Sheriff Patterson from Millbrook." Clara's heart leapt. Mrs. Patterson's son. She'd mentioned he was a sheriff 2 counties over. The door opened again, admitting a tall man with a badge and 3 deputies. Sheriff Patterson took in the scene with sharp eyes. "Afternoon. Gentlemen, Mrs. Patterson, my mother, sent word there might be trouble. Something about a woman being hunted on false charges. This is none of your concern. Sheriff," Morrison blustered. "This woman is wanted in counties where you've bought the law." Patterson interrupted. "But not in mine. I've done some checking. Mr. Morrison. Interesting how all these charges appeared after Miss Clara left your employment. Even more interesting how the witnesses all happen to be on your payroll. You can't prove. Actually, I can." The sheriff produced a telegram. "Had a nice chat with the federal marshal in Prescott. Turns out he's been investigating you for some time. Something about forced prostitution, debt bondage, and interstate trafficking of women." Morrison went pale. "That's ridiculous. I run a legitimate—" "Save it for the judge." Patterson nodded to his deputies. "Arrest him. Thornton, too. The rest of you boys might want to think hard about whether you want to share their fate." The room erupted. Morrison went for his gun, but Elias was faster. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Morrison's weapon flew from his hand as he clutched his bleeding wrist, screaming curses. 2 of Morrison's men tried to flee, only to find more deputies waiting outside. Thornton, seeing the game was up, raised his hands in surrender. In moments, it was over. Sheriff Patterson surveyed the aftermath with satisfaction. "Miss Clara, you'll need to make a statement, but I think we can clear up these false charges quickly enough. The federal marshal will want to speak with you too. Your testimony could help put Morrison away for a long time." Clara sank into a chair, suddenly weak with relief. It was over. The running, the fear, the constant looking over her shoulder. Over. "How did you know to come?" Elias asked. Patterson smiled. "My mother's a formidable woman. When she sends word that an innocent woman needs help, I listen. She also mentioned something about a wedding that needs to happen for real." His eyes twinkled as he looked between Elias and Clara. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "That was just... we were pretending." "Were you?" Elias moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands. "Because I haven't been pretending. Not since that first night when you trusted me enough to follow. Maybe earlier." "Elias." Clara's voice caught. "I'm not. You know what I am. What I've been. I know exactly who you are," he said firmly. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met. You survived what would have broken most people. You had the courage to run when staying would have been easier. You faced down the man who hurt you without flinching. That's who you are." Around them, the deputies were leading Morrison and his men out into the rain. Sheriff Patterson cleared his throat. "We'll be taking these boys back to Millbrook. You folks are welcome to follow when the weather clears. In the meantime," he touched his hat, "I'll leave you to your discussions." Ben followed them out, muttering something about checking the mules. And suddenly Clara and Elias were alone in the dusty room with the rain drumming on the roof. "I have nothing to offer you," Clara said softly. "No reputation, no family, no dowry. Just a past that will always shadow me. I'm not asking for any of those things." Elias was still holding her hands, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her palms. "I'm asking for you, to wake up beside you, to work the ranch together, to build something real and honest in ours. People will talk. When they find out, let them. Our real friends won't care, and the others don't matter." He squeezed her hands. Clara, I've been dead inside since the war, going through motions, existing but not living. Then you stumbled into my life, all fire and determination despite everything trying to break you. You made me want to live again. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. I don't even know who I am anymore. Not the girl from Missouri, not the saloon worker, not your pretend wife. I'm just lost. Then be found, Elias said simply. With me, we'll figure out who you are together, who we are together. Clara looked into his weathered face, saw the sincerity in his eyes, the patient hope. This man who'd asked nothing of her but offered everything, who'd seen her at her lowest and still saw someone worth saving, worth loving. The ring, she whispered. Your mother's ring. I should give it back. Keep it, he said. Make it real. Marry me, Clara. Not for pretense or protection, but because I love you, because I can't imagine going back to that empty ranch without you. The storm was passing. Late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds to paint the abandoned camp in gold. Light found the ring on Clara's finger, making it gleam like a promise. I don't know how to be a wife, she admitted. A real wife. I don't know how to trust that happiness can last. I don't know how to be a husband. Elias replied, Haven't had much practice at happiness either, but maybe we can learn together. Clara freed one hand to touch his face, feeling the roughness of stubble, the warmth of skin. This good man who'd shown her that not all strength came with cruelty, that protection didn't require possession. Yes, she said, the word barely a whisper, then stronger. Yes, I'll marry you. Not Elizabeth Hartley, but Clara, just Clara, with all her past and all her scars. Just Clara is all I want, Elias said, and kissed her. It was gentle, that first real kiss, careful and sweet, as if they had all the time in the world to learn each other. When they drew apart, Clara was crying and smiling at once. We should tell Ben, she said. He'll want to know his pretend passengers are becoming real. In a moment, Elias stood, pulling her up with him, keeping her close. Let me look at you first, my future wife, who fought free of her past and brought me back to life in the process. They stood together in the dusty room while outside the world washed clean. Morrison was gone. The lies he'd spread would be countered with truth, and the future stretched before them full of possibility. I want to go back to the ranch, Clara said suddenly. Our ranch. I want to learn about cattle and weather and all the things that make a life there. I want to plant a garden and mend fences and wake up to mountain sunlight. It's hard work, Elias warned, but he was smiling. Lonely sometimes. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles off. Not lonely, Clara corrected. Not anymore. And I'm not afraid of hard work, just of cages, and there are no cages there. Ben returned then, shaking water from his hat. He took one look at their joined hands and linked arms and grinned. About time. Was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the wagon until you figured it out. Ben Carter, Elias said formally. I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Clara. We'll be needing a witness for a wedding soon as we can arrange it. Be honored, Ben said. Now, can we get out of this death trap of a building before it finishes collapsing? That storm loosened what was left of the supports. They gathered their few belongings and moved to the wagon. The storm had passed, leaving the desert washed and gleaming. To the west, a rainbow arced across the sky, and Clara took it as a sign. No more running, she said, settling beside Elias on the wagon's seat. No more fear, just forward, together, together. Elias agreed, and clicked to the mules. They rolled out of the abandoned camp toward Millbrook, where justice waited for Morrison and freedom waited for Clara. But more than that, life waited. A real life built on truth and choice and love hard won. Clara touched the ring on her finger, no longer borrowed, but claimed she'd fled the saloon's shame, run from all that would diminish her. And in running, she'd found not just a protector but a partner, not just safety, but home. The brooding cowboy had indeed taken her past and her trembling soul, but he'd given her something in return, a future worth having and the courage to claim it. As the wagon rolled through the rain-washed evening, Clara began to hum. It was an old song her mother used to sing, about home and hope and new beginnings. Elias smiled and reached for her hand, and Clara, no longer lost but finally found, held on tight and didn't let go. The Millbrook Courthouse stood solid and imposing in the morning light, its red brick facade a testament to civilization's reach into the frontier. Clara smoothed the borrowed dress Mrs. Patterson had provided, a respectable gray wool more suited to a courtroom than anything she owned. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the collar. "You'll do fine," Elias said quietly beside her. He wore his best shirt and a string tie, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Just tell the truth. That's all anyone can ask." Sheriff Patterson met them at the entrance. "The circuit judge arrived this morning. Judge Harriman, he's fair. Doesn't tolerate corruption. Morrison's lawyer tried to get a delay, but the judge refused, said justice delayed is justice denied." Inside, the courtroom was already filling. Clara recognized some faces from town. Mrs. Patterson in the front row offering an encouraging nod. Ben Carter looking gruff but supportive. Even Miss Winters from the boarding house. But there were strangers too, drawn by the scandal of a saloon owner accused of federal crimes. Morrison sat at a table near the front, his wrist bandaged, flanked by a nervous-looking lawyer from Tucson. He'd aged in the 2 days since his arrest, his bluster replaced by something meaner, more desperate. When he saw Clara, his eyes blazed with hatred. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harriman." The bailiff called. The judge was older than Clara expected, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He settled behind the bench with an air of authority that filled the room. "We're here for a preliminary hearing in the matter of Territory versus Samuel Morrison," he began. "Charges include fraud, extortion, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to violate federal anti-trafficking laws. How does the defendant plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Morrison's lawyer said quickly. "And we maintain that the chief witness against my client is unreliable. A woman of questionable morals who stole from her employer and fabricated these charges to cover her crimes." "We'll let the evidence determine that," Judge Harriman said dryly. "Call your first witness." The prosecutor, a young man named David Thornberry, who'd arrived from Prescott that morning, stood. "The Territory calls Miss Clara." He paused, looking at her questioningly. Clara realized she'd never given her full name to anyone here. "Clara Marie Bennett," she said clearly, using her real name for the first time in 3 years. It felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Clara took the witness stand, placing her hand on the Bible. The oath felt heavier than any promise she'd ever made. As she settled into the hard wooden chair, she caught Elias's eye. He nodded slightly, and she drew strength from his steady presence. "Miss Bennett," Thornberry began, "please tell the court how you came to work at the Golden Horseshoe Saloon." Clara took a breath and began. She told it all, the death of her parents, her uncle's betrayal, the desperate journey west with nothing but false promises. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, finding power in finally telling her truth in a place where it mattered. "Morrison advertised for respectable women to work as servers," she continued. "He promised good wages, clean accommodations, and honest work. For 6 months, it seemed legitimate. Then he began changing the rules, inventing debts, making it clear that serving drinks wasn't all he expected." "Objection," Morrison's lawyer jumped up. "Hearsay and speculation? Overruled." Judge Harriman said, "The witness is testifying to her own experience. Continue. Miss Bennett." Clara described the gradual trap, how Morrison isolated the women, controlled their money, threatened them with arrest or worse if they tried to leave. She spoke of the other girls, some who gave in to survive, others who disappeared in the night. "He told us we owed him for room and board, for clothes he provided, for protection from the rough customers. The debts always grew faster than our wages. It was designed to keep us dependent, to break us down until we did whatever he wanted." "And what did he want?" Thornberry asked gently. Clara's voice dropped, but she kept it steady. "He wanted us to entertain men in private rooms upstairs, for money that went to him, not us. He wanted to own us, body and soul. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Mrs. Patterson's face was stone, but her eyes blazed with protective fury. "You refused these demands?" Thornberry continued. "I did, every time. I kept thinking if I just worked harder, served more drinks, I could pay off the invented debts and leave properly, but the numbers never added up. The debt only grew. Tell us about the night you left." Clara described Morrison's final ultimatum, the threats, the decision to run. "I took only what was mine, $17 in wages he couldn't deny I'd earned, and my few personal belongings. I stole nothing from him." "Yet he claims you took $500 from his safe?" "I never had access to his safe. I didn't even know where he kept it." Clara met Morrison's glare steadily. "He invented that story when he realized I'd escaped, just like he invented the murder charge when the theft story wasn't enough to force me back." Morrison's lawyer rose for cross-examination, his manner aggressive. "Miss Bennett, you admit you worked in a saloon for 3 years?" "I worked as a server, yes." "In an establishment where alcohol was served and men gathered for entertainment?" "Yes." "And you lived above this saloon in rooms provided by Mr. Morrison, because he deducted rent from my wages whether I wanted to live there or not. It was another way to control us." The lawyer tried various angles, attempting to paint Clara as a willing participant who changed her mind, a woman of loose morals who couldn't be trusted. But Clara held firm, answering each question with simple truth. "You claim my client threatened you, yet you never reported these threats to any authority?" "Which authority?" Clara asked. "The Sheriff Morrison paid to look the other way? The deputies who drank free at his bar? I had no one to turn to." When Clara finally stepped down, she was exhausted but unbroken. Other witnesses followed. Sheriff Patterson testifying about his investigation, revealing documents showing Morrison's pattern of recruiting vulnerable women with false promises. A former saloon girl named Mary, brought from Tucson, who corroborated Clara's account with her own painful story. Then came the most damning evidence. Federal Marshal James Crawford took the stand, producing records they'd seized from Morrison's office. "We found ledgers," he testified. "Detailed accounts of debts assigned to women who worked for him. Debts that mysteriously increased whenever they tried to leave. We found correspondence with other saloon owners, discussing the trade in women like cattle. And we found this." He produced a leather journal. Morrison's personal records. He writes quite explicitly about his business model: recruit desperate women, trap them with debt, break their spirits, profit from their bodies. He even rates them like livestock, notes which ones are broken and which still need training. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harriman gavelled for order, but the damage was done. Morrison's carefully constructed facade of legitimate businessman had crumbled. When order was restored, Morrison's lawyer made a desperate attempt at defense, calling character witnesses who testified to Morrison's charitable donations and business acumen, but it fell flat against the weight of evidence. Finally, Morrison himself took the stand. His testimony was a masterclass in deflection and denial. Clara was a disgruntled employee. The federal investigation a misunderstanding. The journal entries taken out of context. "These women came to me desperate," he said, "attempting righteousness. I gave them work, shelter, protection. If some chose to earn extra money in private arrangements, that was their business. I never forced anyone." But under Thornberry's cross-examination, his composure cracked, his temper flared when challenged, and the cruel, possessive man Clara knew emerged. "That girl owes me," Morrison finally exploded, pointing at Clara. 3 years I invested in her. She was nothing when she arrived, and I made her into something worth having. She belongs—" He caught himself, but too late. The courtroom had heard the truth in his own words: women as property, as investments, as things to own. Judge Harriman had heard enough. "I find sufficient evidence to bind the defendant over for trial on all charges. Bail is denied, given the flight risk and the serious nature of the crimes. Marshal Crawford. I'm remanding Morrison to your custody for transport to federal prison to await trial." The gavel came down with finality. Morrison was led away. still shouting about his rights, about conspiracies, about women who didn't know their place. Clara watched him go and felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, just a hollow relief that it was over. Outside the courthouse, the sun seemed brighter than it had in years. Clara stood on the steps, breathing free air, as people approached to offer support. Some were strangers who'd been moved by her testimony. Others, like Mrs. Patterson, enveloped her in fierce hugs. "You did a brave thing," the older woman said, speaking truth in the face of power. Not many have that courage. "I couldn't have done it without help," Clara said, looking at Elias, who stood quietly nearby. "Without people who believed me." Sheriff Patterson approached, touching his hat. "Miss Bennett, the federal prosecutor says your testimony will be crucial at the trial. Will you be willing to appear?" "Yes," Clara said without hesitation. "Other women need to know they can speak up too, that men like Morrison can be stopped." "Good. In the meantime, you're free to go wherever you wish. The false charges against you have been formally dropped, and I'll make sure word spreads to other jurisdictions." He smiled. "I understand congratulations are also in order. My mother mentioned something about a wedding." Clara blushed as Elias stepped forward, taking her hand. "Soon as Clara's ready. We're in no rush now that she's free." But Clara surprised him. "Actually, I'd like it to be soon. I've spent 3 years with my life on hold, waiting for someday. I'm done waiting." Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands. "Then we'll have it at my house, this Saturday, if the preacher's available. A proper wedding for a proper new beginning." As the crowd dispersed and plans began to form around them, Clara found a moment alone with Elias. They walked to the town square, where cottonwoods provided shade and a small fountain bubbled peacefully. "Are you all right?" he asked. That couldn't have been easy, reliving it all. It was necessary, Clara said, and strange as it sounds, it helped. Speaking it aloud in a place where truth mattered, where I was believed. It's like poison being drawn from a wound. "You were magnificent," Elias said simply. "Strong and clear and honest. Morrison never stood a chance against that." Clara leaned against him, allowing herself the luxury of being supported. "I meant what I said about the wedding, unless you've changed your mind now that you know everything." "Nothing's changed," Elias interrupted, "except maybe I love you more for seeing your courage." They sat by the fountain as the afternoon wore on, making quiet plans. The ranch would need work to accommodate 2 people. Clara wanted to learn everything: how to work cattle, tend horses, manage the household accounts. She had ideas about a vegetable garden, maybe some chickens. "It won't be an easy life," Elias warned again. "I'm not looking for easy." Clara replied, "I'm looking for real, for honest work and clean air and waking up without fear, for building something together that no one can take away." As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they made their way back to the boarding house. Tomorrow, Ben would take them back to the ranch to prepare for the wedding. But tonight, there was a celebration planned, a quiet dinner with the people who'd stood by them. Clara paused at the boarding house door, looking back at the courthouse where she'd reclaimed her voice and her name. The girl who'd fled the saloon's shame was gone, transformed by trial into a woman who knew her own worth. "No more running," she murmured. "No more running," Elias agreed, opening the door to warmth and light and the laughter of friends. Inside, surrounded by people who saw her truly, Clara began to believe in the possibility of happiness. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her future. She was Clara Marie Bennett, soon to be Clara Hartley, and she was finally, truly free. Saturday dawned clear and bright, the kind of desert morning that turned the world to gold. Clara stood before the mirror in Mrs. Patterson's best guest room, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back. The cream-colored dress, borrowed from the banker's wife, fell in simple, elegant lines. Her hair, usually pinned severely back, cascaded in soft waves adorned with small white flowers that Miss Winters had picked at dawn. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Patterson said from the doorway, "like a woman starting fresh." I feel fresh, Clara admitted, smoothing the skirt. New, is that strange? Not at all. You've shed an old skin. Dear, this is who you were meant to be. Through the window, Clara could see guests gathering in the garden behind the boarding house. Ben Carter stood with Sheriff Patterson, both in their Sunday best. Miss Winters arranged wildflowers on a small table that would serve as an altar. And there, tall and straight in a black suit she'd never seen him wear, stood Elias. He's been pacing since dawn. Mrs. Patterson confided with a smile. That man's faced down bandits and storms without flinching, but the thought of wedding you has him nervous as a schoolboy. Clara felt her own nerves flutter. Not from doubt. She'd never been more certain of anything, but from the magnitude of the moment. In an hour, she'd be Clara Hartley, a rancher's wife with a future stretching ahead instead of a past dragging behind. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. To her surprise, Mary entered, the woman who'd testified at Morrison's hearing. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I hope you don't mind," Mary said shyly. "I wanted to bring you something, for everything you did." "I didn't do anything. You spoke up. You stood in that courtroom and told the truth when most of us were too scared. Because of you. Morrison's gone. Because of you. Maybe other girls won't fall into the same trap." Mary pressed the package into Clara's hands. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have it." Clara unwrapped the paper to find a delicate silver hair comb adorned with small turquoise stones. It was beautiful, clearly cherished. "It was my grandmother's," Mary explained. "She always said it brought luck in new beginnings. Seems like you're due for all the luck you can get." "I can't accept this. Please, let something good come from those of us who survived." Mary squeezed Clara's hand. "Be happy. Show the world that we're more than what was done to us." Clara tucked the comb into her hair, the turquoise bright against the auburn. "Thank you. Will you stay for the wedding?" Mary smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." The ceremony was simple and perfect. Reverend Thompson, a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, spoke words about new beginnings and the courage to trust after trials. Clara barely heard them, lost in Elias's steady gaze as they stood beneath an arch of desert willow branches. When it came time for vows, Elias spoke first, his voice rough with emotion. "Clara, you came into my life like a storm, shaking me awake from a long sleep. You showed me that survival isn't the same as living, that the past doesn't have to define the future. I promise to stand beside you, to build a life worthy of your courage, and to love you through whatever comes." Clara's voice was clear and strong as she replied, "Elias, you showed me that strength could be gentle, that protection didn't mean possession. You saw me not as what I'd been forced to become, but as who I could be. I promise to work beside you, to make our ranch a home, and to choose you again every morning for the rest of our days." The ring Elias slipped onto her finger was new, a simple gold band he'd bought in town to complement his mother's ring. "2 rings," he murmured. "One for the past that brought us together, one for the future we'll build." "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thompson declared. "You may kiss your bride." The kiss was sweet and full of promise, earning applause from the small gathering as they turned to face their witnesses. Clara felt the last chains of her old life fall away. She was Clara Hartley now, wife, rancher, free woman. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful. Mrs. Patterson had outdone herself with a spread of food, and someone had brought a fiddle. As afternoon faded to evening, Clara found herself dancing with her husband in the garden, lanterns casting warm light over the happy gathering. "No regrets?" Elias asked as they swayed to a slow waltz. "Only that we didn't meet sooner." Clara replied, "Though maybe we weren't ready sooner. Maybe we both needed to break first, so we could heal stronger." Wise words. Mrs. Hartley. The name sent a thrill through her. Mrs. Hartley, a respectable married woman with a husband who loved her and a home waiting in the mountains. If someone had told the girl crying in that saloon room a week ago that this would be her future, She'd never have believed it. As the party wound down, Ben Carter approached with a grin. "Well, you two gave me the most interesting freight run of my life. From pretend marriage to real wedding in a week. That's got to be some kind of record." "Thank you, Ben," Clara said, kissing his weathered cheek. "For everything. Just glad it worked out." "You folks take care of each other now." He winked at Elias. "And if you need supplies brought up to that ranch, you know who to call." The next morning, Clara and Elias set out for home. Their home. The wagon was loaded with wedding gifts and supplies for setting up proper housekeeping. Clara wore practical clothes again, but the rings on her finger caught the light with every movement, reminding her that everything had changed. The ranch looked different as they approached in late afternoon. The small adobe house that had seemed like temporary shelter now beckoned as home. The cattle in the distance, the garden plot waiting to be planted, the vast sky stretching endlessly. It all belonged to her now, as she belonged to it. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hartley," Elias said, helping her down from the wagon. Clara stood in the dooryard, breathing in the clean air scented with sage and possibility. No smoke from saloons, no drunken voices, no locked doors. Just the wind and the mountains and the man beside her. "Show me everything," she said eagerly. "The spring, the pastures, where you think we should put the chicken coop. I want to know it all." Elias laughed, the sound freer than she'd ever heard from him. "We have time, all the time in the world." As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold, Clara helped her husband tend the horses and start supper in their small kitchen. Simple tasks, but she performed them with the joy of someone discovering ordinary miracles. That night, as they sat by their own fire in their own home, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. The frightened girl fleeing through darkness seemed like someone from another life. She'd run from shame and degradation, found danger and unexpected grace, faced her demons in a courtroom, and emerged transformed. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked, watching her face in the firelight. "About that first night, when you found me in the rocks. I was so scared, so certain my life was over. I never imagined." She gestured at the room, at him, at the whole improbable happy ending. "Life has a way of surprising us," Elias said. "Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes." Clara moved to sit beside him, fitting naturally against his side. "She fled the saloon's shame," she murmured, remembering the words that had echoed in her mind during those desperate days, until the brooding cowboy took her past and her trembling soul. "Is that from one of those novels you mentioned?" "Something like that." Clara smiled, though the real story turned out better than any novel. Outside, coyotes called across the desert, but the sound no longer frightened her. She was safe. She was loved. She was home. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer held power over her future. Tomorrow would bring work, learning to manage a ranch, building a life with Elias, perhaps testifying at Morrison's trial to ensure he never hurt another woman. But tonight, in the circle of her husband's arms, with their whole future spreading before them like the star-filled desert sky, Clara allowed herself to simply be happy. The girl who'd fled was gone. The woman who'd found courage, love, and freedom had taken her place. And that woman, Clara Hartley, rancher's wife, survivor, thriver, was exactly who she was meant to be. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from today? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from listeners around the world and know what touched your heart in Clara and Elias's journey.